for this chapter. There are undoubtedly some historical and economic shifts that will take place between the philosophizings of Plato and Aristotle and the kinds of thinkers that will emerge in chapter 7. Now, keep this in mind. Greek and Roman civilizations were sort of in turmoil during the periods that we'll be talking about in chapter 7. There was relative socioeconomic instability for a wide number of people. And keep in mind that at the time that Stoicism hits the fore, large numbers of people were still not just virtual slaves, but were slaves. Life was not good for too many people. So it's sort of no wonder that the kind of philosophies that we'll see developing, and it's not just my word, but the author of the text doesn't use it. The kind of philosophies that we'll see in chapter 7 will be what I like to term life philosophies. Instead of attempts to make systematic accounts to try to address every philosophical question under the sun, like the Platonic and Aristotelian schools of thought did, Plato and Aristotle's thoughts were extremely systematic, tried to address a whole host of philosophical questions. I hope that you notice that the ones we see in chapter 7 are more of what I like to call life philosophies. This is because what they try to do is they try to give us what these thinkers thought was good advice for dealing with a difficult world, not on our terms, but on whose terms? On the world's terms. In other words, they were trying to give sound advice for how to live well under challenging circumstances. Now that's why you might see a lot of the Stoic wisdom, for example, show up in a lot of self-help literature, if you can call it that. What I find so odious about the explosion of self-help literature over the last 50 years is that most of us, it is completely knocked off, plagiarized, ripped off from the ancient wisdom of the world, and then repackaged as some kind of pseudo-scientific psychological garbage. The fact is, much of the world's great wisdom that you will find ripped off by quote-unquote self-help gurus, and by the way, I guess my own politics will be showing a little bit here, but I happen to believe most of these self-help gurus are really just in the business of helping whom? Themselves. Helping themselves. So they can sell a lot of books that don't teach us anything more or anything new under the sun that wasn't already a piece of ancient life philosophy traditions. Now that I've been thoroughly offensive, I better move on from here. Now, Mr. Peters asked a question at the beginning of class about these other isms that were discussed prior to Stoicism. Those other two isms are part of setting the stage for the discussion of Stoicism, the main subject of the chapter. Now, the first one that we encounter is cynicism. Folks, cynicism was certainly a way of looking at and dealing with the world. But to call it a school of thought would be totally a misnomer. Because these Cynics, they were so individualistic that the whole idea of having a school of thought would have been antithetical to their outlook on life. Now, cynicism, and by the way, it's where we get our word cynicism, But the word cynic literally comes from the Greek word for what? Comes from the Greek word for dog. The reason why they got their name is they were said to have lived like dogs. Most of them did not what? They didn't have homes, they didn't have families. And this is partly because they believed that life was short and that you shouldn't do what? That the more you avoided entanglements, the better off you would be in the long run. By the way, they deeply admired what ancient Greek thinker we discussed already?
Socrates.
Yeah. They had a deep admiration for Socrates. And this is because Socrates was, according to their account, he was individualistic. And by the way, the thing that's important about individualism here is the idea of being self-reliant. You can't depend on other people. You can't depend upon the world. Oh, and by the way, when I say he was self-reliant, I mean something like this. He had his inner strength. And he did not let what other people thought about him affect how he knew he was. Is that okay for an answer? Yeah. He was not impressed with other people's opinions. And by the way, the Cynics similarly, not impressed with other people's opinions. Now the author of the text talks about one Cynic in particular, although there were others. They give the example of the Cynic Diogenes. Diogenes was definitely a character. He didn't have a home. He pretty much lived out in the open except when the weather was bad, where he's said to have done what? He curled up in an old wine cask, to get shelter from the storm. By the way, the Cynics did not despise the pleasures of the flesh. This is one place where they certainly differed from Socrates. They understood that life was short and that you perhaps should at least enjoy as best you can the little bit of time that you've got. But they also believed that you should not become too reliant on physical pleasures for your happiness. And I'll go on the record here, it's going to be slightly vulgar here, just a little bit. When Diogenes did get his hands on a little bit of money, any guesses where he didn't mind spending it from time to time? Brothels. Whorehouses, chicken ranches, whatever word you have for brothels. But yeah, he had no problem with that. And he didn't believe there was any shame in it either. He certainly also didn't believe that anybody deserved respect. There's a funny little story. He was quite disrespectful to Plato. Plato is said to have defined man as a featherless biped. How many of you have heard this story? To which Diogenes plucked a chicken and said, "Here is Plato's man." Yeah, just shows you the idea. Simply because he's this famous guy, aristocratic family, with a fabulous school of philosophy, doesn't mean he's not going to treat you irreverently. It's one thing you got to love about this guy. But yeah, this was Diogenes and Cynicism. Now, there's certainly certain things to admire about this. he certainly didn't let his opinion of himself get affected by what other people thought. And I happen to think that's been a problem with me, and it's a problem with a lot of people. Whenever we put too much stock in what other people think of us, we ultimately aren't better off. We let other people define us. Cynicism says that's not wise at all. And you're also less likely to be happy, because you'll be constantly what? I'm sorry. Do you ever know these kind of people? Constantly saying they're sorry for things they didn't even do. It's tiring. It's extremely tiring. You're better off not worrying so much about these things. Oh, and one more thing I almost skipped over. Like Socrates. They didn't believe that possessions were things that could make you happy. As a matter of fact, possessions are more likely to weaken you. Because once you become reliant on possessions, you're going to just need more of them to keep you happy. And people who place too much stock in their possessions are certainly in the long run more likely to be disappointed. Because when hardship finally does strike, and you lose these things, you will be more affected than those people who didn't put as much stock in them. Or I guess I'll give you some other examples. A lot of people just love getting new stuff. But keep in mind, it's expensive, so it ends up costing you more time and energy in the long run to keep getting new stuff. But you know the benefit of your old beater that you might be driving around? Do they still call older cars that are not in such great shape anymore beaters? The one good thing about the old beater is, if somebody ends up opening their door into the old beater, another dent's not going to hurt. But whenever the person has a brand new car and is just all hyped up about the brand new car, and they come out and some jackass has keyed the side of the door or something, that person will be utterly devastated. Not saying that you shouldn't get new cars and things of this nature. But to keep in mind that whenever you place so much stock in your possessions, you are going to be more likely to be hurt in the long run. And that's really what this advice is here. And by the way, there's similar advice to be found in the Wisdom of the East. Next. The author of the text spends some time on the hedonistic account of happiness. Now, the author distinguishes two kinds of hedonism. So-called Cyrenaic hedonism. Cyrenaic hedonism was espoused by a fellow by the name of Aristippus. You won't have to know his name for the test. And then there's another version known as Epicurean hedonism. Now, Cyrenaic hedonism is the hedonism for rich dudes. That's probably the easiest way to put it. Cyrenaic hedonism refers to hedonism for rich dudes, meaning that the good life is determined by acquiring it's determined by acquiring as much physical pleasure as possible. Now, of course, the reason why I call this hedonism for rich guys is because if you don't have the wherewithal to buy these pleasures, good luck getting them. This is why this kind of hedonism in the long run is probably not a wise approach. Because the fact is, the more refined your taste is for certain things, the more costly it is. Now granted, if you're like Aristippus and you were extremely financially well off, it probably wasn't such an unreasonable idea to say, well, enjoy the time that you've got. Spend your money and have a good time. Because how long do you got?
In those days, what, like 35 years?
Yeah. Well, turns out that if you were fairly well off, you were more likely to have gotten things like medical attention, well, for what it was worth back then. In other words, you probably had decent nutrition. I'll give you a couple of examples. Socrates lived to the ripe age of 70, and he likely would have lived longer had he not been executed. But to make Mr. Peters' point, though, if you were not well-to-do, your life expectancy was typically very short. If you were not well off financially, your life expectancy was very short compared to modern standards. I'll give you another example. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes from the 17th century, was aged 90. That was not that unusual for financially well-off people during that period. But if you were not financially well-off, you were the ones who drove down average life expectancies. Your odds of making it out of your teen years were actually low. Infant mortality rates were high, etc., etc. But I'm glad we mentioned this, because one of the things that is appreciated by these schools of thought is that life is a finite commodity. You are better off if you take the little that you got and you enjoy it as best that you can. You'll be dead soon. And I know this. In the grand scheme of things, ladies and gentlemen, I will be dead soon. On average, if I live to be the average age of the average American male, I've got about 30-some odd years left. But based upon my family's cancer history and things of that nature, I probably don't have that long. So I recognize that my life is a very finite commodity. So I better enjoy it to the best of my ability. You don't have long. There's no time left to use. And this is why you probably shouldn't be worried. You know the old cliche about sweating the small stuff? Probably shouldn't be sweating the small stuff, and you probably should try to enjoy things to the best that you possibly can. Now, I'm running out of time.
45.
Thank you. I'm really running out of time. We can put off Chapter 8's homework till Monday, so ignore that part of the email. I did want to talk about Epicurean hedonism very briefly, and we'll spend half of next class on Stoicism and then start Chapter 8 on Friday, at least get a start on it. Epicurean hedonism, by contrast, and by the way, all hedonisms say that happiness is best defined in terms of pleasure. Aristippus said that the more physical pleasure you get, the happier you will be. And by the way, by physical pleasures, we're talking about what many people would call the gritty pleasures. The pleasures that don't last long but feel really good when you got them. That kind of thing.
So could you say that people who use heroin are hedonists?
Well, in this sense, well, perhaps at first they are. But to sound like Epicurus, very quickly they become what? Very quickly they become slaves to their addictions. And I don't have time to write on the board here. How many of you have seen the now cult classic film Trainspotting? You know, from the late 1990s, based on an Irvin Welsh novel. The sequel, 20 odd years later, just came out last year. If you were a fan of the first one, which I guess if you didn't see it, you're not, the second one is well worth seeing. Spoiler alert, I won't give you all the spoilers, but the main characters are basically from working class schlub families in Scotland. Their parents and their parents' generation basically gave them meaningless, listless lives, and they believe that life is more or less not that worth living in postmodern society. So they've got an out. And to borrow the line from the beginning of the film, he goes, I chose not to choose life. I chose something else. That's from the opening lines from the Ewan McGregor character. Heroin was their answer. And this is because, as one of the characters says, better than sex, mate. Better than sex. I do a really bad fake Scottish accent, so you'll have to bear with me. You know, she said, imagine the best O that you've ever had in your life and multiply that by a lot. By O, I don't mean Oprah Winfrey. I mean the orgasm word. He says, imagine that and then multiply it. It's a line from the film. In other words, heroin feels what? Very, very good. I fortunately wouldn't know. I'm glad I don't know. Because very quickly, because of what it bonds with in the brain, eventually you need more and more and more of it. And by the way, you don't have to see the film to know what the carnage will eventually look like. Because the fact is, whenever you're messed up on drugs, you're probably not getting out to the gym very much. And this is kind of what happens to one of the characters in the film, who's all about working out and so forth. Well, he doesn't make it. That was a spoiler. He doesn't make it. But yeah, some of the things that are incredibly quote-unquote pleasurable are so short-lived that they are really not worth pursuing. And this is why Epicurus is going to counsel a version of hedonism that will focus on moderation. Because if you want pleasure long-term, the moderate life is actually the way to go. More on that next time.